Tick-tock clock is one of the hardest linear platforming stages in all of 3D Mario. Before being kicked out of the stage was the most discussed criticism of Mario 64, the critique most frequently brought up was that, as a general rule of thumb, linear stages did not belong in a collectathon. I'm pretty sure the first time I heard that comment was when Banjo and Kazooie came out, and was further cemented as Rare released their quartet of games on Nintendo 64. Now, I think many of the criticisms in relation to those discussions have already been debunked, and gamers have at least to some extent acknowledged that a lot of these so-called open sandbox styled games, specifically these classic ones, have a lot more linear aspects to them than previously thought. But there are still hours upon hours of videos that will specifically throw a blanket statement on Mario 64 that the reason it's bad, or rather the reason specifically certain stages are bad, is because of the linearity that exists through those stages. The funny thing is, many of those stages do a pretty good job of masking the linearity to some extent. Bob-omb Battlefield and Whomp's Fortress, for instance, have a specific linear path that is meant to be followed, but they find a way to mix up the routes a bit and place stars in locations that at least somewhat hides the linearity, or at the very least tricks the player into avoiding the linearity with the objectives and stage set pieces. Cool Mountain is massive, but the stage generally trends downwards so that a player can maneuver quicker down the linear path rather than trek their way up. After that, the stages get a lot more open. In the basement stages, the pyramid and the volcano do a lot of the linear style heavy lifting, but those only make up 2 or 3 stars in their respective stages. Aside from that, everything else through most of the stages are at least semi-open and have multiple paths the player can follow, even if one may stick out more than the others. That is, until you reach Tall Mountain. Tall Mountain basically takes all of the hand-holdy crutches from the first floor and removes them altogether. It has split paths, but they're further and fewer in between. It has areas to explore, but they're not vast and open areas. It has a lot more bottomless pits, a lot of ways to fall, and a lot of requirements to climb upwards. I already discussed Tall Mountain, so I don't really need to get into that again, but basically, take everything I said about the jump of difficulty that you see from Whomp's Fortress to that stage, and multiply it exponentially to reach Tick-tock clock. More linear, more difficult, more falling, more climbing, more ways to lose a life. Even more narrow pathways, and more obstacles, and just more stage gimmicks. Tick-tock clock is one of 2 stages on the final floor of Peach's castle, and these 2 stages are perhaps the most infamous of all of the stages in the game, and it's explicitly because of their linearity. Now that being said, there are also many people that love these stages, and often like to relegate the criticisms of these stages into the get good category. We'll set Rainbow Ride to the side for now and focus on the clock. I can respect both points of view. This is an endgame stage, and it should be difficult. It should be frantic and have upbeat music to make us feel as rushed and energetic as we felt while undergoing the fast-paced slide challenges. But it also should not undergo good stage design for the sake of that difficulty. And I think that's the specific question I'm setting out to answer by the end of this segment. Is Tick-tock clock a good endgame difficulty spike, or is this difficulty strictly a result of poor game design? Now, as a general idea, the stage is made up of narrow paths, moving upward, flipping and rotating platforms, cage landings, and just all-around internal gears in motion that you have to traverse around. The path more or less spirals upwards towards the peak of the clock. I could be wrong because it's a very hard stage to really break down, but looking at some complex maps and playing through the stage, it seems to me like there are basically 6 rotations you make around the stage to reach the peak of the clock, with the challenges kind of broken off into half sections, or half floors, I guess. Which makes sense, since that would mean that there are 12 segments or challenges or sub-floors or whatever you want to call it, a player needs to undergo to reach the top of the clock-themed stage. Honestly, this is more thought than I've ever given the breakdown of the stage, and I'm not sure if 12 half-floors are common knowledge because I've never heard anyone mention that before. So if all of a sudden people online start talking about how Tick-tock clock has 12 floors and praising the ingenuity of the developers for that application, make sure you remember that it was Nintendo that first made it public knowledge. Or, leave a comment in case it was something obvious that everyone already knew and I was too dumb to figure it out. But just to be clear so we're not confused, I'll be referring to the clock's base or the starting point as the first floor. A half rotation up will be the second floor, and a full rotation will be the third floor, and so on and so forth. I'm sure I'll lose you at one point or another, so I'll do my best to be as coherent as possible while maybe throwing a map on the screen to help us track. But anyway, first star, roll into the cage. It has you run up 1.5 rotations to make it to the star-holding cage so it's on the 4th floor, or 1/3 of the way up the clock. You have conveyor belts, pendulums, rotating and revolving obstacles along your path. It's a very difficult challenge on a first-time playthrough because you not only have to control Mario in a tight space, but you have to do it quickly, which is not something most people will be used to since it wasn't all that common up until this point. And this is made even worse because if you fall, you're at the mercy of your location. You could land significantly lower, or you can unluckily drop to your death if you're in the wrong spot. Honestly, even returning players can struggle with these aspects of the stage because so little of the game requires precision movement of Mario that this becomes a bit of a whiplash. As many will point out, you can offset the difficulty by jumping through the clock at the correct time to freeze all the mechanisms inside, and returning players will certainly do that to make the stage easier, but that only solves the issue of everything being in motion. You still have to be good enough to control Mario in a tight space. This star alone is already enough of an example of why the stage is so hated by new and old fans alike. But let's move through the rest of them because there will be a lot of repetition if we have the conclusion discussion now. The second star, the pit and the pendulums, effectively sits a full rotation above the first star, so it's on the 6th floor, or halfway up the clock. Basically, you face the same challenge you just endured as you head upwards, but instead of jumping in the cage on the first star, you jump on top of the cage and continue upwards. The big challenges here are maneuvering over a rotating triangular platform over a pit, and then jumping through pendulums over pits on a narrow platform to collect the star. Again, if you learn the gimmick of slowing down the stage due to where you enter, you can make this easier, but even at a slow speed, players will struggle if they haven't mastered the control of Mario yet. This is another very hard start, and it's not only hard because of what you endured beyond the first star, but realistically, a player can and will still struggle just to make it up through the first star and beyond, so even the stuff that they already accomplished is an obstacle. The third star is Get a Hand, and it sort of pulls a fast one on you. First off, you can't really grab the star while the stage is stagnant. I mean, you can if you're a veteran and know the maneuvers, but the average player will be grabbing the star the intended way. The star only requires you to move up a single rotation, which means you get to the 3rd floor. The catch is, it sits between the 2nd and 4th floor, opposite of the 3rd floor, which would normally be a blank wall, but instead it's a little alcove. In order to get there, you need to stand atop the thin hand of the clock and let it take you there. Again, simple enough to traverse to, but getting on the clock, comfortably moving Mario around, and being able to adjust the camera, and avoiding the enemy that tries and burns Mario's butt all add to that little bit of challenge that could make this way harder than it should be. Add on to that the fact that you have to be confident in your ability to make the jump off the clock's hand and into the star that many first players don't have, and you get another star that will frustrate even returning players despite seeming pretty straightforward. 4th star is Stomp on the Thwomp. In the previous linear stages I mentioned earlier, this star would have been the first star. It's the peak of the clock. It's the star that you're meant to see the entire clock to get to. Not only is it all the way up on the 12th floor, but you had to do an extra challenge to get on the opposite side of it. In stages like Whomp's Fortress and Tall Mountain, they would send you straight to the top so you could see the whole stage on the first star. But in Tick-Tock Clock, they ease you into it with the first 3 stars before sending you upwards. Pass by the first star, pass by the 2nd star, and even pass by the 5th star. More rotating platforms, more risky jumps, more tight maneuvers, more ways to die. But you make it to the top, you catch a ride on yet another clock hand that'll spin you around to a conveyor belt that'll allow you to make your precision jump onto Thwomp and reach the star. Yada yada yada, challenging, etc, etc. Let's move on to the 5th star. It's almost directly above star number 2, and forks off during your route to star 4, and it sits roughly 2/3 of the way up to the top of the clock on floor 8. The route is in a bit of a blind spot. The camera fools you into moving into a specific direction which you would take towards star 4, but you're meant to head in the opposite direction of the camera. This isn't all that uncommon. A similar play was done at the floor of the volcano in Lava Land that required players to head in the direction opposite of where the camera is pushing you when you enter. And it's not that obscure because you'll certainly notice the route, or in this case, the cage the star sits in while you're going around the stage, so you'll know to eventually head back to this point if you accidentally miss it. But once you get to that point, it should be easy enough for you to make your way to the star. But again, get good, learn to play, and all that jazz. Finally, star number 6 is the red coin star. Many players will immediately notice the red coins because they're right next to you when you start the stage. Many players, myself included, will give up on trying to get the other stars because they keep losing a life and decide to go for the red coins and be incapable of grabbing more than 1 or 2 and slipping off. Obviously, the challenge of the star is not the star itself. Rather, it's about learning the stage gimmick of how to enter the stage. A player will no doubt notice the clock's moving parts all going about at different speeds as they go through the varying stars. This is similar to Wet Dry World in that you might simply assume the stage is changing because you selected a different mission. But the difference is you're a lot more likely to lose a life and get kicked out of Tick-Tock Clock, so you'll be re-entering quite a bit and you might notice different speeds in the stage. All of these strange speeds will ideally make a player experiment with the entry into the stage, and hopefully that'll be when they start trying to time their entry with the moving hand on the clock. I'm not sure if this is how the average player figured it out, but this is how I eventually figured it out when I was 6 or 7. All it takes is noticing the stage is acting differently with 3, 6, 9, or 12 o'clock, and that is enough to experiment to figure out that time is fast, slow, or stopped. And I gotta imagine most people will naturally gravitate towards trying 12 o'clock first anyway, since that points upwards, and 12 o'clock is generally the time you'll be leaning towards using as often as possible. It makes the stage significantly easier, or at least the stars that you can still grab that don't require moving parts. But specifically, star number 6, the red coin star, is an actual joke here. Second easiest red coin star to grab when the platforms are all stopped, with only the lethal lava land red coin star being easier. But again, the challenge here is figuring out the stage gimmick and not the actual collection. And I'm not gonna lie, I kinda love that they made it the 6th star, because the average player might end up collecting all 5 stars, going through all of that work and trauma and struggling to master the stage until they finally figured out that a lot of it could have been made so much easier if the minute hand was on the 12. You get the benefit of learning the gimmick to make the stage easier, but you're also forced, whether you like it or not, to learn how to traverse the top of the clock. You take the same paths multiple times, you make the same jumps, you fail in the same locations. It doesn't matter how many times you do it, it's still going to be a challenge unless you become an expert at controlling Mario. You have to become an expert here if you want to earn that 120 star count. Prior to this, there were a few moments sprinkled throughout the game that might require a double or triple jump, a stagnant backflip, or even a wall kick or long jump or dive. But in most areas of this game, all of these different jump techniques were options that you could attempt while running in safe areas. They weren't required. In tick-tock clock, you actually have to know how to use a specific jump, and it'll be most players' preferred method of control. I'm not sure how most people get through tick-tock clock without learning 2 things. First, it's the importance of stopping Mario in place before making a turn so that he can do a quick 180-degree pivot. That's pivotal, pun intended, to succeed in this game even prior to tick-tock clock in some instances. And second, it's the cartwheel. Everyone always used to talk about how the long jump was their favorite jump to get through the game due to the range, and more recently the dive has become the preferred horizontal leap since it's both quicker and can damage enemies. But it's a lot safer to use a long jump than a dive, so it's usually the default means of traversal for players. When a player wants height though, the double jump can suffice. Backflip if you need something more extreme. But if you don't have the real estate or time to pull off a backflip, the cartwheel is where it's at. I figured this out at a young age. That's how I beat tick-tock clock. That's where I learned to master Mario's control. And look, I know the term master is fairly relative. I've used it quite a few times as I've gone through this retrospective. When I say master, I don't mean that I'm in the top 1% or even 20% of people that control Mario in the world. What I mean is that I've mastered the control enough to get through the game comfortably on repeat playthroughs, and I'm inclined to believe that most people that love Mario 64, and especially love tick-tock clock, are folks that master the controls as well. They're the ones that defend the stage. They're the ones that enjoy the challenge and the experience it puts them through. They're the ones that didn't mind the 100 coin star mission because traversing through the stage, especially if you stop the clock at 12 o'clock, is very easy if you know how to control Mario. But that's the thing, you have to be willing to learn how to control Mario in order to enjoy this stage. That's why I love tick-tock clock. Imagine a setting this unique not being loved. Imagine a late stage challenge not being celebrated and praised. Tick-tock clock is easily within a shout of being my favorite stage in my favorite game of all time. But I'll save that discussion for when I do my tier list in the conclusion. I love the linearity here because it's such a focused and direct path that challenges you to traverse upwards. It challenges you to learn how to play the game. It's such an intense training session that even if you succeed, you have to run through it again. You'll be running past the first star 3 times in the stage, past the second star for 2 stars, and past the 5th star for 1 star. But I'll be frank, you'll need to do this multiple times because the goal here is not finishing the stage, it's mastering the stage. It's for that reason why I personally don't think any of these stars are actually redundant for a first-time player to go through, and why I think it's for the better that it's done this way. The reality is, you're never going to make it to that 4th star in a single run regardless. You're going to fall to the bottom and either lose a life or have to work your way back upwards again. Heck, you probably won't even make it to star 2 in a single run. This stage is designed like a classic linear 2D platformer, in that you're going to need to push and push further along, losing lives and getting game overs over and again, mastering each section of the clock more and more as you traverse upwards. It's intentionally designed that way. That's why the 4th star is all the way at the top of the stage and not the 1st star. Despite continually moving along the same route for the first 3 on the way up, I don't find this star redundant at all because those repeat runs are what you'll have to keep going through if you even want to think about getting good enough to get to the 4th star. And look, I understand that might sound like a cop-out, or that I'm backing off the stage because I have nostalgia bias or whatever. But keep in mind, stars 1, 3, and 6 are all in the bottom third of the clock, and star 2 sits right above them at about the halfway point. So it's not even like I'm sitting here saying you'll go through this entire stage 6 times to master it. It's really stars 4 and 5 that require that extra bit of traversal, and they branch off of one another pretty quickly after you reach star 2, so each of their routes and challenges to the star are much more unique than you think. It's just that first bit of traversal to get started on the stage that's repetitive, and that will teach you to traverse beyond the halfway point for stars 4 and 5. Not to mention the added benefit of being thrown out of the stage more allows players more of a chance to figure out the speed and time gimmick. Or better yet, it allows them to utilize the gimmick if they figure it out prior to the red coin star. And to break it down even more and hopefully convince you that I'm not simply making an exception for this stage and applying the same logic in all of the previous stages, Star 1 ends in a cage that a conveyor belt and rotation platform surround. Star 2 is at the end of a narrow platform challenge that requires you to pass by swinging pendulums over a pit. Star 3 is in an alcove that you can't exit unless you make a super risky jump onto a moving thin clock hand. Star 4 is all the way up at the top of the stage, away from everything else, and Star 5 is in a cage that a bunch of moving platforms over a pit have to be traversed in order to escape. In all of these cases, it's almost certainly easier for a player to start back at the bottom of the stage than it is to have to go through these challenges in reverse and more likely fall down because they failed. And furthermore, in the case of all of these stars, the final challenges you have to actually undergo to retrieve the stars will not be gone through more than once, and that will strictly be when you're trying to pick up the star. So while yes, you'll be going through a main path multiple times, and that aspect of it may feel redundant, it's not like you'll be going through the same challenges that are specific to each star, or even the sub-challenges that lead up to the final challenges. The routes are actually a lot less repetitive than people make them out to be, and I think many players conflate having to do the stage over and over again because of all the deaths they get with how many times they are actually repeated because of the stars. Because really it's just the first turn up to the platform above the red coins that actually feels all that repetitive in the stage. So yeah, none of the stars I just mentioned are worth a strike for sending you back to the start of the stage. Because in all cases of these stars, for multiple reasons, it's better to be sent back to the beginning for the sake of time, ease, and learning the gimmicks and control of Mario. With the only exception here being the red coin star, that one kind of has to get a strike because the star location is literally at the start of the stage. I could be petty and say that it's the 6th star, so it should send you back to the start of the stage regardless, but you obviously can collect the red coins whenever you want, so that's not too relevant. Either way, we're now at 22 of 98 redundancy stars, and I think I've said enough about tick-tock clock. It is, in my opinion, a good endgame difficulty spike. And I've probably confused more people than intended, but in my defense, this is a very confusing map to explain. But one thing I know for certain, tick-tock clock is much more enjoyable when you learn how to control Mario, and the stage itself teaches you how to control Mario in those tight and quick thinking spaces. And you're going to need every ounce of those control skills when you head over to the final course of Rainbow Ride.